Leading LSU historian Dr. Kodi Roberts came to the Hammond Library for Black History Month talking about one of the most popular subjects there is, the Civil War, and in particular your contention that it really wasn't so much about heroes and villains, especially not about Abraham Lincoln as a hero.
Yeah, I think it's important to get away from the hero worship, not because these people aren't important, but because it can be disempowering for individual citizens. If we look closely at the history, we can see that, again, Lincoln's as much following trends as he is creating them. And if we pay a lot of attention to the other folks who are pushing Lincoln toward things like emancipation, I think it's a lot more empowering, it's a lot more encouraging for modern citizens trying to decide how do we look at history as a blueprint for how to tackle modern problems.
Well, Lincoln is often described as the man who freed the slaves. I think you'd take issue with that.
Well, absolutely. I think in a lot of cases, the slaves are the ones who freed the slaves, especially when you talk about mass escapes during the Civil War and running behind Union lines. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation is very important, but it's not until the passage of the 13th Amendment after the war that slaves are freed. And by that time, Lincoln is arguably not the most important actor in the ratification of the 13th Amendment.
Also, you had some rather shocking quotes from Lincoln over the years.
Yeah, the politics of the day dictate what you can and can't say. And the politics of the day said that African Americans were an unequal and inferior race. And Lincoln didn't come down too far from the general consensus on African Americans during his career.
For example, even in the middle of the war, he still essentially wanted to send the slaves back to Africa.
There's a lot of push for colonization prior to the war. Lincoln is still pushing for it during the war. I think acknowledging that slavery may have had to come to an end, but also acknowledging that there would be maybe irreconcilable problems after the war if slaves stayed in the country.
In fact, Lincoln had many opportunities to free slaves that he didn't take during the war.
A lot of Union generals, as I discussed in my talk tonight, are much more interested in pushing an end to slavery and actually try to end slavery in different locales in the South before Lincoln's willing to do it. And Lincoln actually has to pull them back. So those are arguably missed opportunities, but in the end, you got a much more complete form of emancipation after the war was over.
What lessons then do we draw from all this for the modern day? Because so much of modern America can be traced right on back to the Civil War.
Absolutely. I think what my takeaway is that if you have a political opinion and you're sure that you're right, that you should be willing to push that opinion, even if the people in power haven't quite caught up to you yet. And eventually, if you keep on them and you keep the big politicians aware of what the people want, then eventually they will cave to you.
Of course, everybody watching this thinks, gosh, I wish I would have been there, but in 2 weeks from this recording, you'll be back.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to do a talk on the war after the war, looking at aggression in the Confederacy against African American participation and African American organization to ensure a place for African Americans in the social, political, and economic future of the South.
In fact, your contention is that the war really didn't end in a place like Louisiana in 1865, but rather 12 years later.
Right. The years between the end of the Civil War and Southern redemption in 1877 are very violent, very militarily contested, and you have the power of a lot of terrorist groups constantly being fought by the federal government, the Union military going through great pains, or what had been the Union military going through great pains to suppress terrorism and vigilante violence all throughout the South, that again makes it look as if the war never quite ended.
At this moment in Alabama, you have the state Supreme Court justice saying that they don't need to follow federal law. The term nullification, which goes back even before the Civil War, it's back. Governors saying they're not going to follow the national law on a thing like health care, for example. So consequently, are these battles still to be fought again?
Well, I think any contested space as far as national policy goes, where national policy seems to rub up against local sentiment, is a reoccurring theme in national politics, and it's something we can't get away from. It's not, again, like you pointed out, it doesn't start with the Civil War, and it certainly didn't end there. I don't think we should expect that those battles will go away. I think we should expect that because we fought them and won them before, that we can fight them and win them again.
Well, for example, the Civil War is the most popular subject in literature except for the actual Bible. It's fascinating to many of us, and maybe you can illustrate that the reason is when you look back, it's not just dry history. It seems to resonate today just like it was yesterday.
The more we look into the Civil War and we look into the details, if we don't get stuck on the hero worship of folks like Lincoln or demonizing folks like Jefferson Davis, if we get into the details of the politics and what were they arguing about and how long did they argue about it and how did they finally come to a resolution, I think those things do resonate today, and we can learn a lot of lessons about political contestation.
You know, for instance, in 3 states, Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday is celebrated along with Robert E. Lee Day. So it illustrates that history is still politicized, and isn't that infuriating?
Well, it's a little confusing more than it is infuriating. I happen to live on Robert E. Lee Boulevard, so I know exactly where you're coming from. That being said, I think what that is an opportunity for us to keep this conversation going. A lot of folks want to say we've already made it there, and we don't have to talk about race anymore, and these things are people just dredging up the past. But when you drive onto an avenue named after a Confederate general, then that suggests that the past hasn't quite gone away yet.